All statements and opinions expressed by guests of the Adult in the Room podcast are strictly their own and do not necessarily reflect the beliefs or opinions of the host, producers, or advertisers. All interviews are presented in their most complete possible form in the interests of free speech. No statements should be interpreted as financial, legal, or medical advice. Listener and viewer discretion are strongly advised.
It's the Adult in the Room podcast with Victoria Taft. That's me. Welcome to a special edition of the Adult in the Room podcast with Victoria Taft. How you doing? Well, the so-called QAnon shaman, whose name is Jacob Angeli Chansley, became the face of the January 6, 2021 Capitol riot because he was dressed as a guy with horns, and he had, he looked like a wolf. Barely any clothes on except that stuff. And it was January, remember, in Washington, D.C. And because he was there, he was jailed, put in solitary confinement for a long stretch of time. He committed no acts of violence and got a police escort while on his jaunt in the Capitol that day. So on this edition of the Adult in the Room podcast, we're going to go into the backstory of this man. We're going to ask him some questions. He may not be able to answer all of them because guess what? The legal system ain't over for him, even though he's been released from prison and gotten out of, like a halfway house. So we're going to go into the backstory. We've got lots of questions, and we're hoping that he gives us the answers he can. You know, Chansley was mocked. He was locked up, muted, and blocked because of his views. You may not agree with his views, and that's okay. But you can't agree with the way he was treated. And this has just been a nightmare. I'd like to ask Jacob Chansley just the first question that may be a multi-pronged response on your part, but what are the biggest myths about you and what you were doing that day in 2021?
Well, to start, let's start with the idea that I'm a failed actor, never acted a day in my life. Let's then move to this notion that I call myself the QAnon shaman. Never did that. That was a name given to me by Alex Jones shortly after January 6th, and the media just ran with it. Then there's also a lot of people that, have said that I was violent or that, I did all sorts of things. One person even called me a murderer, which is just crazy. So there's a lot of misconceptions because of the Operation Mockingbird Media and their smear campaign against me and the straw man that they chose to make me using my image to push this shock and awe campaign that they then used to divide the country.
We've been told who you are. Who are you not? You're not a failed actor and all that stuff that you just listed. But is there anything else that is said of you that is not true?
Well, yeah, there's people that say I'm a BLM or Antifa protester. Not true. I was at BLM and Antifa protests in Phoenix to march with the police. As also kind of acting like
the cops. Did the police know you were marching with them?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And I was kind of like a counter-protester attempting to red pill some of the audience or some of the protesters there. But eventually it became quite clear that not only did they not want to hear what I had to say, but they were developing a certain disdain for me. And what really did it for me at that whole thing was because I went to a number of these, rallies or these protests here in Phoenix, marched with the police, etc. And what really did it for me, though, was there was no violence against police. So that was part of the reason why I was marching with them. It was to show solidarity. But also, the BLM and Antifa crowd were carrying around rainbow flags with the satanic pentagram. They were wearing, in some cases, shirts with the satanic pentagram. One guy was wearing a COVID mask with a satanic pentagram. They also were carrying around a communist flag, red and, flag with a yellow hammer and sickle, and they were all calling each other comrade. And so I thought to myself, well, these people aren't going to listen to me at all, so I might as well just stop wasting my time.
Well, BLM, of course, is a Marxist organization. It's that there's not even a quibble about that. And, the general feeling about BLM is that they'll, say and do anything to bring on the latest iteration of communism that will befall the United States. And so you're not wrong to go, well, I guess they're not going to be red pilled anytime soon.
Well,
okay.
And another thing is there's a lot of talk that I'm CIA or that I'm a Fed.
Yep.
None of that's true either. Disinformation spreads pretty darn fast. It's incredible.
What was your feeling about Donald Trump? And for example, what were you doing the day before January 6th? Where were you and what did you do? How did you spend your time?
Well, when it comes to Donald Trump, I was very skeptical in the beginning, but I watched him very carefully. I watched the things he said. I watched the things that he did. And eventually it became quite clear that the deep state and the Operation Mockingbird Media apparatus that covers up for the deep state was very anti-Trump. And as I began to explore further what it is he was doing in the presidency, it became quite clear why that was, because he was trying to basically halt the military-industrial complex and the war machine. He was attempting to dismantle the globalist apparatuses that have injected themselves into the United States and our policymaking and our government. And when it comes to January 5th, on January 5th, I was driving to D.C. from Georgia because there was a rally in Georgia that I went to prior to January 6th. We arrived in D.C., I believe, I think it might have been the morning of January 5th. And then the next morning, the rest is history.
Were you dressed as the QAnon shaman or the Wolfman?
I just call it my shamanic regalia.
Your shamanic regalia. Were you dressed like that the day before, or did you just save that for Jan 6?
No, I was in a suit and tie. I had my American flag bandana on. I had my American flag aviators on. And I don't always dress that way. I just dress that way for certain events and certain protests and rallies.
Yeah. So January 6th, you were there. Obviously, we have video of you at the Capitol. You were surrounded by police officers who appeared to be escorting you through the building. Which entrance did you come through? Were you allowed in via a nice, friendly police officer friendly at the door, letting you in? How did that all happen?
Well, my attorney, due to our motion in the courts that is currently being litigated, has urged me not to speak of the events on that day at the current moment, and I am sorry that I can't bring your audience the details on that. But that being said, everybody saw what they saw on Tucker Carlson's show. And you have made it a point to say that you were already getting out of the halfway house or jail or prison, and then onto the halfway house before he aired that. And can you tell us a little bit about that? And how did the airing of that video change the situation for you, if at all? Well, it really didn't, except for in the court of public opinion. Yeah, that's important. Very important. Especially considering that the Operation Mockingbird Media and the government have been attempting for going up until that point, about 2 years, to create their own narrative that would allow them to centralize power and go after political dissenters. So I think I got my release date sometime in mid-February, and it was set for March 28th. And then I believe it was like March 7th or March 8th that Tucker Carlson aired that footage. So it was just a divine synchronicity that 3 weeks before my release, I was, some people would say, vindicated on national television. Right. The fact that there was such a video that showed you just being escorted, and you were not being followed, you were being escorted. They were leading the way and opening doors for you. I mean, it was really weird. And so inside the Capitol, and does that change your defense at all?
the fact that this video has come out and now everyone can see? You said it did make a difference in the court of public opinion, but they can see that this happened, that you were allowed, you were escorted through the building. Does this change anything legally for you?
Well, that's kind of what the motion in the courts is all about.
What's the motion?
The motion is basically that it's a 2255 ineffective assistance of counsel, and it's a motion to vacate my conviction or vacate my sentence. And the judge can do whatever he wants with it. He can say, yeah, I'll hear this, or no, I won't. There's also some stuff in there about the conflicting dates given by the government regarding when that footage was made available, and the fact that technically the government didn't do what they were supposed to do regarding exculpatory, what could be considered exculpatory evidence.
Obviously,
you see,
yes.
How it normally is supposed to work is that the government builds a case, then they make an arrest, and then they file charges. With many J6 cases, what happened is that they made an arrest, they filed charges, then they built their case.
Yeah,
and this
they
was
can drive
something,
the case.
Yeah, this is something that a lot of attorneys, defense attorneys have said, hey, whoa, this isn't being done the way that it's supposed to be done.
Right. In fact, one of the renowned defense attorneys in this country, Harvey Silverglade, who's been a previous guest on the Adult in the Room podcast, has said to Kenny and myself, Kenny being my engineer, that he believes this was basically a roundup, and that is wholly unconstitutional about what they've done to the J6 defendants. Okay, so you can't say what you were doing on January 6th, but you can talk about the kinds of people you saw. And here's why I ask. There's a very reputable man who, I'm forgetting the organization for which he works, but it's a well-known organization, but I've allowed it to escape my memory. But he wrote a piece right after that, and he talked about the kinds of people he saw. Now he's an intelligence security writer and a person who looks into this for a well-known organization. And he said he saw what looked to be agents provocateur in the crowd, some of whom were dressed in gear that looked like boots, and they looked like they were ready for a battle or something like that. Who were those people?
Well, I can't say per se. One thing I think is very interesting is that there's a lot of speculation on whether or not the crowd was infiltrated by federal agents. Mm-hmm. If we look at
that's demonstrably true.
Well,
they were.
But if we look at the history of the government's involvement with covert operations or even clandestine ones, but mostly covert, what we find is that, like, for example, Operation Northwoods, where the government was talking about bombing hotels in Florida to blame it on Cuba so they could invade Cuba, or Operation Fast and Furious during the Obama administration. The list goes on with all sorts of government malfeasance and the infiltration of by certain agencies into certain groups, and then the provoking them to commit crimes. So, and then there's also the added bonus in this case of there's a lot of talk in certain crowds that the whole reason why the footage hasn't been released to the public, or why it can't be released, I even think this is something, an argument the government made, was because that there are literally hundreds of federal agents in the crowd, and that they
would be shown. Oh yeah,
well, yeah,
totally.
Exactly. It would blow the lid off the whole thing.
Right.
So,
well, they said just methods and sources and that sort of thing. They always cop to that. Well, we're going to give away what we do. Well, MPD has already admitted that they were, in fact, we've seen the video just this last week in which the Metropolitan Police Department in DC were fielding people who were agents provocateur in the crowd, urging them to go up the scaffolding, urging them to go, chanting with them, get in there, that sort of thing, which is, I didn't think that was part of the gig.
Well, and that's what's kind of strange about all of this, I think, is that think about that for just a second, and the fact that if it's true, and I'm just going to say allegedly or if, okay? If it's true, then that means that these federal agents were tying up their bootstraps, tying up their bootlaces. They were putting on all of this stuff with an intention in mind. Now, a lot of them are likely minions or lower level, right? And that means that they were getting their orders from above their heads. And these people above their heads were saying, this is what you're going to do. Now, here's the thing. In order to orchestrate something like that, you need large amounts of planning. Mm-hmm. Right?
Yeah, this didn't just come together that week.
No, it did not come together at all. You know, this was a well-orchestrated and highly organized effort.
So okay, let me ask you this. You were there, you identified as one of the big shots in the crowd because of the way you were dressed. Had you been looped in on what was going to happen on January 6th by any of these people?
No, goodness gracious, no.
What did you think was going to happen on January 6th?
Well, the thing is that I was there at the MAGA Million March on December 12th. So there was 3 MAGA Million marches, one in November, one in December, and one in January. So I went to the one in December, and there were people around the Capitol. There were people around the Supreme Court. Everything was fine. It was all peaceful. And that's what I anticipated on January 6th. Now, what I think is really interesting about this, because the media narrative has largely divided the country into people that say it was a peaceful protest and then other people saying it was a violent insurrection. Now, first of all, if you want to know what a violent insurrection looks like, just look at what happened in Afghanistan when Biden botched that withdrawal. That was a real insurrection. Secondly, there were over 1 million people in D.C. on that day, okay? And that means that the amount of people that actually were there at the Capitol and committed very real crimes is less than 1% of the amount of people that were in D.C. for the MAGA Million March on January 6th. So think about that. When one side says that it was largely peaceful, they're talking about what? About the over 1 million people that were there, which were largely peaceful. Do you see what I'm trying to say? But then the other side...
That's how CNN can stand in front of an Antifa and BLM riot and where they're setting things on fire and say, well, it was mostly peaceful, which they did.
Yes, they did. For weeks, months at a time.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So you just thought it was going to be like one of the mega millions or, million MAGA march deals. And I don't think anyone else... do you think Donald Trump made this happen? Did he make you do that? Did he make you walk into the Capitol?
Well, I don't blame Trump. A lot of people say that they would be mad at Trump for not getting a pardon. And the way I look at it is, well, it's not his fault. Why should I put blame on him? I'm a man. And as a man, I take responsibility for my actions. I don't try to blame somebody else. Now, my previous attorney tried with all of his might to point the finger at Trump. Unbeknownst to me, I only found out the extent of the things that he was saying in the media upon my release from the solitary confinement and eventually getting to a point where I could get out and look at media and see some of the things that he was saying. Once I was released to the halfway house and stuff like that.
He called you short bus. He said you weren't smart, that you don't seem dumb to me, but whatever. But some people would say you went on January 6th. That, of course, is objective proof that you're dumb. And so I guess that's where your former attorney is getting that. So what do you say to that? Maligning of your character?
I would say that what happened to me is a perfect example of what has been happening to the American people for a long time. And that is that you have a lawyer coming to you, an individual, or we, the people, and saying, I would like to represent you in this legal system here. And I will do this, and that. And that's exactly what he did for me, is he made all sorts of promises. And because I didn't understand the legal system, I believed what he was saying. And so because we, the American people, don't understand the legal system, we trust the wrong people to do the right thing. And they claim they want to represent us and our interests, but the fact of the matter is they represent themselves and their own interests, and they're applying for a job that they are largely, I would say, unqualified to do. And the reason I say that is this. For the most part, unless somebody is already in office or already like the president or something like that, they do not have the security clearances and the full amount of information to make promises on the campaign trail in the first place. So they have no real frame of reference. They're just saying what they think people want to hear. So I think that my individual example of trusting an attorney, which Washington, D.C. is full of attorneys, trusting an attorney to do the right thing is like trusting the devil to do the right thing. I mean, there's a reason why they say, the hell is filled with lawyers.
Yeah. So were you really aware of the fact that he did you no favors when he went on Tucker Carlson and talked about the video that he himself had never seen, which obviously gave an entirely different viewpoint of what you were doing that day? Did you finally look at him and go, when he's like, "Whoa, I don't know"? I mean, he did not acquit himself well on that television interview, I have to say. It was just
well, the thing is that in the original...
Talk about short buzz.
Yeah, in the original Discovery package, that video was not in there. That is part of what's in the motion. So that is unequivocally true. However, Albert Watkins, I would never hire him as my attorney. If I could go back and pick another attorney, I most certainly would have.
And who's your new attorney now?
His name is Bill Shipley, William Shipley.
Yeah. So he's on Shipwreck Crew on Twitter,
yes,
right?
Yeah, he's Shipwreck Crew.
How'd you get together?
Well, after my sentencing and all of that, he contacted my mother, who was equally upset, if not more upset than I was about the outcome. And an outcome that Al was trying to assure me and my mother was not going to be. And so eventually he contacted my mother, and then I conversed with him over the phone and basically said, all right, well, I'll fire Al if you want to be my attorney. And he agreed.
Wow. Well, it looks like he's trying. I mean, I think he's a never Trumper. So, I mean, he's a guy who, he gets it from both angles. He's pretty down the line, middle of the road. And you want a former prosecutor, which he is, to be able to represent you and, not get too far into the weeds politically and that sort of thing. Are you happy with him so far as your attorney?
So far, he seems to be doing all right. I didn't know he was a never Trumper.
Well, I think that's his rep. I mean, he might be.
It hasn't really come up, because
exactly.
It's a legal matter. And
Sure.
As a former prosecutor, he knows the nuances of prosecution and what is supposed to be done and not supposed to be done. He was a federal prosecutor. Yeah.
And now he's a defense attorney, and thank God he has experience in the federal federal jurisprudence. Okay, so I wish you well in that effort. So now you've given us an idea of where you were, before I go off into this other tangent, did you see Antifa?
Well, this is the interesting thing about that. At pretty much every single Trump rally that I had ever been to prior to January 6th, even on December 12th, there were counter protesters, Antifa and BLM, right? But on January 6th, there were none. So what does that say? Where did they go? What did they look like? How are they dressing?
Well, yeah. So we saw a video of people changing their clothes and, from Black Bloc into Trump regalia or vice versa. So when you have those videos, or you have the video that shows that, it does make you wonder. And when the guy who's standing right next to Ashley Babbitt is a BLM/Antifa guy, it makes you wonder, okay, what the hell was he doing there? And how many more of him are there?
Yes, very much so. There's all sorts of questions that beg answers. And the Operation Mockingbird Media has done everything they can to ensure that those answers do not reach the public and that the questions do not even get asked.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I'm sure. Now, the people who talk on your behalf, your loved ones, your mother, for example, how has she been treated? Because my understanding is many J6 people's families have been put on no-fly lists. They've been stopped and searched. They are followed. And what has your experience and your mother's experience been like in this case?
Well, my mother, God bless her heart, as soon as all this stuff happened on January 6th, she was ambushed basically by the Operation Mockingbird Media right outside her home. So, there's all sorts of crazy stuff that I could go into.
Can she travel?
I don't know if she was put on a no-fly list. I don't even know if I'm on a no-fly list, to be honest with you.
Can you travel?
Well, not right now. I'm on supervised release. So my probation officer is basically saying, look, if you want to try to travel outside the state, we're going to have to develop a rapport. You're going to have to show me that you're going to, basically go along with your terms of probation before I go letting you go to another state, which is fine. It's totally understandable. My probation officer is a good man. He's fair, strict but fair. And I don't think that that's anything that's abnormal. So, I wonder sometimes if we haven't in the family been more heavily targeted because of the fact that it's so public. I don't know. I don't know what the real reason is. There's things that have happened, but it all could be circumstantial. And it could be like, well, it's hard to say, but I'm quite certain the feds are probably listening to my phone calls.
Oh, I would count on it. Did you
Which
get
is
any?
Fine. I have nothing to hide.
Right. Well, no, not anymore. I mean, even if you did before that, you seem to be fairly sanguine about this whole thing. I mean, you've had a lot of time to think about your attitude about being thrown in prison and being put in a hole and solitary confinement for months on end. Can you tell us about your prison experience?
Well, solitary confinement was terrible. It is a form of soft torture. To the cognitive system, it's akin to being starved or sleep deprived. So it does turn even the strongest minds into mush. I've heard of people coming out of the hole after 30 days and, being shell-shocked. I spent 10 and a half months in solitary confinement.
And you were accused, and you pled guilty. You pled guilty to two felonies and two misdeeds.
No. I pled guilty to one felony.
That was the deal. Okay.
And it was, from what I understand, it was a terrible plea deal. Bill was telling me, I never would have had you sign this. This is a terrible plea deal. And looking back on it, from what Bill has told me, I'm like, wow, I had no idea. Al was a terrible attorney.
And which felony did you plead out to then?
I believe it's obstruction of an official proceeding.
My God, that's the one they bootstrapped to all of them just to make it a felony so they could throw you in prison. So, and you could be on a terror watch list and all that. That's why they did that. That's the Enron thing, not to mess around with witnesses and other kinds of information and evidence during a trial. That was what that whole thing was all about. It's a post-Enron law statute, and that's what they've bootstrapped onto all the J6 stuff just to get a felony on them, so they can put them on watch lists and make terrorists out of them. So, did you see any terrorists that day?
Nope.
Yeah. What were you thinking that day? I mean, what was in your mind? I know that
I can't really go into it.
Yeah, I was going to say you probably can't do that because that goes to state of mind. But I mean, my hope is that you will. I mean, you've already served your time.
One thing I'll tell you is this: my I've always advocated for over a decade for peaceful, nonviolent, non-cooperation with evil. I believe in the teachings of Christ. I believe in the teachings of Gandhi and Martin Luther King Jr. and how it is that those things can be employed to affect incredible social and political change. That is, in fact, the only real sure way to affect real social and political change, because it carries with it a certain badge of honor and a certain level of maturity that calls upon even tyrants and their systems to reevaluate their behavior and analyze their karmic choices.
Were you surprised that the feds came down as heavily on these people as they did after what had happened during the quote-unquote Summer of Love in 2020?
Well, yes and no. I mean, if you look at what they allowed certain people to get away with, and the fact that like 90 to 95% of the people that were arrested had the charges dropped, then it really shouldn't be a surprise. Now, interestingly enough, there has been testimony from FBI whistleblowers that have come forward and said that they were told that they are not allowed to investigate BLM or Antifa.
Right.
And there's
it's
also
a choice. It's a prosecutorial choice.
Yes, it's called prosecutorial discretion.
Mm-hmm.
That's to prosecute, okay? That's
Some
where you
discretion.
can drop charges, okay? But FBI investigation is an obligation. The only way that you can't do that is if the people above your heads are telling you, no, 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 no. So what we were saying earlier about people above these people's heads saying, get your boots on, put on this, gear, etc., and go in and do this, we have to ask ourselves, who is in leadership at these federal agencies? And we also have to ask ourselves why it is that the FBI was choosing to take people off of very real and dangerous cases like child trafficking, child rape, terrorism, gun and drug running and stuff like that. Why are they taking people off of violent criminal cases and placing them on misdemeanor cases in the January 6th case?
It's a real good question. It's a real good. It sounds like it had a political aim, and there was a political process to do that. I mean, it sounded like a foreordained outcome, but you did have to have people go along with it. You had to have people show up and riot. That was a riot.
Well,
on one side of the Capitol, it was a riot. The other one, they were letting them in.
Yeah. So I would love to talk about it more. Mm-hmm. But I'm being a good boy and doing what my lawyer asked.
Yeah, Bill would probably come after me if
he wouldn't be happy with me. That's for sure.
No, I noticed that he was on this is the way I knew that you were available for interviews, is a Twitter Spaces, and he chimed in, and I go, okay. He was wondering what the hell you were doing this for, because he didn't want you talking. Okay, so there have been so many things that have occurred to you. What was the worst day in the past? Since January 6th, what has been the worst day for you?
It's hard to say. One thing I want you to try to know or learn about solitary confinement is that the days seem like weeks, the weeks seem like months, and the months seem like years.
What did you do?
Well, box breathing, spiritual meditation exercises, physical exercise. It was hard to read books because when you have a 25-year maximum sentence hanging over your head, it's hard to get your mind off of that. A lot of the time I heard, I think his name is Andrew Tate, talking about how when he was in solitary in Romania, he realized that thinking inside of a jail cell is very different than thinking inside your home. Because let's say you have a thought that you don't want. What do? You pull out your phone and you start to scroll, and then eventually just your mind gets off it. Or you say you have something you want to research, and you're like, I wonder what that is. And then you look it up, right? Well, in in the jail cell, you can't do any of that. And if you got this 25 years hanging over your head like an anvil in a Looney Tunes cartoon, and it's being held by a very thin string, you're sitting there wondering what's going to happen, and you have to try to push these negative thoughts out of your mind over and over and over again, but they keep coming back, and they come back more intensely as time goes on, and you realize that they're not going to let you go. So, I can't really identify one day. I could just tell you this. There were certain times throughout my, in particular, solitary confinement where I didn't want to live anymore. But I also did not want to die. So I was left with this just extremely upsetting and very uncomfortable way of living and thinking and feeling. And the worst part was I couldn't defend myself. The media was saying all sorts of things about me that weren't true. The government was making me out to be a terrible person. My attorney, I find out, later on down the road after he'd already said some of these things to the media, saying preposterous things that I never asked him to say and I never okayed him to say. So, and on top of all of it, I cannot defend myself. The first time I ever actually got to speak to the public or to the court after my arrest was during my sentencing. And the judge himself said that in his 34 years, he had never heard a criminally accused speak the way that I spoke. He had compared me to Martin Luther King Jr.
So he meant it in a good way. You just never know sometimes. I can see why. I've seen you speak. You're very eloquent. So here we are. And the worst day was sometime when you were in solitary confinement. And what was the best thing that happened when you got your liberty sort of back, when you were let out of the prison?
You talking about like when I went to like halfway house type of stuff?
Yeah. Or since. What's the best thing?
The best thing was getting that ankle monitor taken off my leg and being able to get on, the road and drive where I wanted to, see my dog, see my family, spend Easter at my mom's house with my family. It's the little things that you take for granted. It's really nice being able to go to the gym. It's really nice being able to go to the grocery store. It's really nice to just go for a walk outside. These are the things that most people just take for granted. And I want you to think about something. If they can do this to me, if they can do this to Donald Trump, they can do it to anybody. And this is the way it's been. This is the way that it has been, Victoria. It's just now it's finally coming to light because the American people have been asleep at the wheel. And it's almost like when you, on the side of the road, as you start to veer over, you hear that, you know what I mean, of the roughness on the side of the road. And you wake up, we've been asleep at the wheel for a while now, and nefarious forces have taken the wheel, and now we're having to realize, okay, I'm being carjacked here, I'm being kidnapped here. What can I do? And our nation is being kidnapped, and many people in this country suffer from Stockholm syndrome.
Yeah. You call them the Mockingbird Media, the Operation Mockingbird Media. Tell people what that is, because there actually was a Project Mockingbird or something like that to undermine
Operation Mockingbird,
Operation
Project Mockingbird. It's when the CIA infiltrated all the major media outlets in the 60s and the 70s so they could control the narrative regarding the civil rights movement and the anti-war movement. And I promise you...
No one has any trouble believing it, by the way, because of all the other things that the CIA has done that we found out subsequent to it.
Exactly.
I know that. I never would have believed, Operation Northwood. I never would have believed Fast and Furious. I never would have believed the Operation Mockingbird Media. Nope. Or Mockingbird. I wouldn't have believed it now, but they're true.
Well,
and I see how... And you see what they do to you. They see what they do to Donald Trump right now. It's just insane. They're fully capable of doing that.
To anybody.
To anybody. Sure.
To anybody. And this is what tyranny looks like. And I got another question for your audience. what would evidence of government corruption look like? What would it look like? Would it look like moving public money into private hands over the course of decades through proxy wars in countries we have no business in? Would it look like somebody being able to erase 30,000 emails or destroy Blackberries and iPads with no prosecution? Would it look like vice president's son being able to go over to foreign nations and get $1 million deals where they're sitting on the board of corporations that they have no expertise in whatsoever? Would it look like 10% for the big guy? Would it look like the child trafficking rings that have been clearly shown to exist within the government? You can look into Barney Frank and his child sex trafficking ring. You can look into Lawrence King and his child sex trafficking.
Barney Frank's lover, or his partner, was running a call boy operation out of their apartment.
Yes. With underage kids. With underage kids.
I mean, unbelievable.
And a representative.
That really happened, everybody.
Yes.
That's insane.
Yes. Representative Lawrence King was he was trafficking children through CPS to child sex trafficking rings and satanic rituals. You can look into the testimony of Paul Bonacci. That's Bonnacci. And the stuff that young man went through as a kid, as a part of these rings, is unspeakable.
I have every reason to believe that goes on, because I know something about child trafficking, because I've looked into it and spoken with people involved, and I do. And I also know that as a result of this overflow on the border, we are encouraging it. And that is just shameless. It is soulless. It's beyond outrageous. There is no word to quite describe how awful it is that we are complicit in that. And I know, I recognize people are probably, Victoria, the United States has done much worse things than that. Okay, fine. That doesn't make it right. That's pretty bad. So what's your biggest regret of the past, I don't know, 4 or 5 years?
Well, I try not to live with regret. Regret is like hatred. Regret is self-hatred, okay? And like hatred, it is far too heavy a burden to bear in order to move forward in life.
So what do you do? I know you do believe in shamanism and that sort of thing. Can you give us the 30,000-foot overview of what your beliefs are?
Sure. So shamanism is the oldest religion in the world. It's the first religion. And shamanism is largely practiced all over the planet in different ways, different languages, but the formula is very much the same. So they all believe in like a god or a unified field of life, a collective soul, if you will. And they all believe in a spirit world and the ability to interact with that spirit world. They all believe in healing and healing people through energy and stuff like that, energy, frequency, and vibration. They all believe in like chasing off evil spirits or exorcism or things of that nature, chasing evil spirits out of the ecosystem through drumming, singing, dancing, etc. They all believe in the idea of sacraments, whether that be certain plants or fungi for incense or for
hallucinogenics
or hallucinogens, yeah. But also, like for plants that heal you if you get sick. Sage, it has all sorts of wonderful antiviral, antibacterial properties, antifungal properties. So it isn't just used to smudge as almost like an incense to chase off evil. It can be used to consume in a tea to make yourself well.
And you, this has been a belief system of yours for quite a few years. You were brought up a Catholic, as I recall. And then you were sort of urged strongly to engage in that. And you've also had some family issues where, you loved your dad, but he sometimes drank too much and just got nasty and made your life a living hell. And he's no longer with you right now. He's, you can talk about that if you want. I'm not sure that it's germane to hear, but it is people do want to know how you ended up as you are and at the Capitol on January 6th. You seem like you were a Navy guy. I mean, all sorts of these things that parts of your life. How did those all coalesce to show up at January 6th and become the QAnon shaman? Who first of all gave you that name?
Alex Jones.
And are you friends with him?
No, not per se. He just did an interview with me after January 6th where he was not very friendly, to say the least. He interrupted me a lot and called me a liar and all sorts of stuff, called me a kook. And he's the one that came up with that title, Q Shaman or QAnon Shaman. And the media ran with it, and they said that I was the one that called myself that. I'm the self-entitled QAnon Shaman, which that never happened. And, half the reason I have so much mistrust of the Operation Mockingbird Media is because there were so many stories about me that weren't true. So I ask myself, okay, there's all these stories in these newspapers or on the television or in magazines or on the radio that I know nothing about. I have no information about it whatsoever. And am I going to trust this media corporation that was infiltrated by the CIA a long time ago?
Like
Operation
Twitter was.
Mockingbird is still in effect.
FBI and Twitter.
Yeah, am I gonna entrust my view of reality to these organizations that are lying boldly and just entirely like full of fallacies about me?
Mm-hmm.
No, I'm not going to trust that. Are you kidding? No way. Get out of here.
How was your childhood? You seem like you really love your mother, and she's
I
gone
love
through hell for
everybody,
you.
including my dad. I take the Jesus route. Treat others the way you want to be treated. Love, judge not lest you be judged. Forgive, all of that stuff. And it's really made my burden quite light. Christ said, my burden is light. So if you just kind of go down that road, you find that life is much easier. Or it's much more simple. That's what it is. It's much more simple. So my childhood was filled with all sorts of trials and tribulations. I got picked on a lot in school. I had to deal with an alcoholic stepdad, and he wasn't, I didn't view him as my stepdad. He was always my dad. But I had to deal with that. I had to deal with all sorts of internal issues because I have always been called to the mystical path. I've always been called to the shamanic path, to wanting to know what enlightenment is, what God is. Who is Jesus? What's the real story behind him? Who's Buddha? What's the story behind that guy? Who's Krishna? What's the story behind that person? What's up with Hinduism? Why do they have these beings with all these arms, and why do they worship cows? These kinds of questions. And I eventually found answers.
You were in pursuit of spiritual awareness, and that somehow you ended up paying a lot of attention to politics. And why was that?
Yeah, kind of. Well, I'm of the belief that our socioeconomic and geopolitical systems are so distorted and corrupted because our spiritual beliefs have become so heavily distorted and corrupted.
I think so.
Yeah, I think that they're reflections of each other. And then if we but had a spiritual perspective that was more aligned with the collective objective universe, the real reality of things, which is why I practice shamanism, then I think that we'd be living in a wholly different world that isn't as corrupt or as destructive or as diseased, or, there wouldn't be famine, there wouldn't be warfare, there wouldn't be chaos, there wouldn't be all of this pain.
Well, man is a fallen individual, and manhood, our entire mankind is fallen. You're not going to get away from all of those things when you have people who are fallen in this world making the decisions. I mean, you're still going to have some tough times. That's my viewpoint. That's my viewpoint.
But I think it's because we're in the situation we're in because, like I said, we fell asleep at the wheel, not just in the United States, but all over the planet. We chose to trust our governments. We chose to trust our media corporations. We chose to trust these international corporate conglomerates and international government conglomerates. And so, we're in the mess that we're in because of, you could say human beings are fallible, but I think It's because we keep trusting these old men who created all these problems to fix them. Yeah, but you're going to fix these problems that are lining your pocket? Give me a break.
I've got some questions that people 201 wanted me to ask you when I talk to you at this moment. And how was the vegan food in jail? That's the other thing everyone wants to know. They want to know that your dietary complaints were they made the news. I don't know if you fully appreciate that.
Yeah, I heard about that.
Yeah.
But it wasn't vegan. I'm not vegan. I only eat organic.
Okay.
So pesticide-free, non-GMO. That's my diet. And how was it? Well, in all honesty, they didn't live up to their word. That's for sure. I definitely didn't get all organic, but when you're starving,
yeah.
Yeah.
So did they accommodate? Did you get to go to the law library ever?
Only when I made it to prison, when I finally made it to prison.
How many different prisons were you in?
Well, just one prison. I was in a number of holding facilities.
I see. And it was that, how many? I talked to one who said he's been to 13 of them.
Well, I started out, they sent me to Florence, Arizona when they arrested me. And then from Florence, Arizona, they sent me to Oklahoma for a night, Grady County. And then from Grady County, they took me to D.C. And then the D.C. jail held me there for 11 days. And I fasted for those 11 days. And I got my court-ordered organic diet. They moved me to Alexandria Detention Center. I was there for about, 5 to 6 months. Then they moved me to Inglewood, Colorado for a month to do my psychological evaluation. Then they moved me back to Alexandria, Virginia. Well, then they moved me back to Oklahoma for a night or two. Then they moved me back to Alexandria, Virginia. I got there. I stayed there for like another 6 months. Then they moved me to Oklahoma again. And then from Oklahoma, and I was in Cimarron at that time. And then once they moved me from Cimarron, Oklahoma, the detention center, they moved me to Safford, Arizona. And that was that's where I spent the remainder of my time in federal custody.
Hard to meet with your attorney when he doesn't know where you are.
Yeah, that happened a couple of times. And in all honesty, Alexandria, Virginia it was very difficult for my attorneys to get a hold of me. And they gave reasons why that I think are just complete and utter baloney. But I mean, they always have certain social media outlets. Like, for example, Facebook. Facebook recently, it was a picture of my face in the face paint and the horns, but just my face. And somebody got their post taken down because Facebook said that it violated their policies regarding nudity and sexual activity.
Oh, please. Of course.
But think about it. Facebook also owns Instagram, and Instagram has recently been ousted and shown that they are allowing pedophiles to communicate on their network openly and advocating for pedophilia. But my face is violating their terms for nudity and sexual activity.
Right. The Wall Street Journal brought that story out in the last week or so. Let's see. Did you see a lot of cops in the crowd on January 6th?
I'm sorry, but I just
can't say anything about it.
I just don't want to step on my lawyer's toes. There will come a time when I can talk about these things, and I really want to talk about it now. I have lots of opinions on it, but I just.
Yep. You spent some time in the Navy. How long were you in the Navy? And does the Navy have MOSs, or what was your job?
So I was in the Navy for 2 years. I was in hazmat on the USS Kitty Hawk. I was in the hazmat division. Eventually, I got moved to the maintenance division for the whole supply department. I was administratively separated because I refused to take the anthrax vaccine. So I got a general discharge under honorable conditions. It was like I never joined the Navy. I didn't get my GI Bill, but I also didn't get a tainted record. So I was refusing vaccines before it was cool.
I know I've asked you a lot of things that are untrue that people have said about you. What's the wildest thing that people have said about you and still believe to this day?
Probably the wildest thing is that I'm a CIA operative or a Fed. There's also the accusation of being racist, which is just total horseshit. Forgive the language. But there's also this that I saw. One of my fans showed me that when I was in prison, it was floating around on the internet that not only was I not in prison, but I was in fact in Afghanistan helping Antifa and fighting alongside Al-Qaeda. And I just like had to laugh my butt off because that was the one that took the cake. I was like, wow, all this other stuff, and that is what people are coming up with, huh?
And they call you a conspiracy theorist. That's very interesting. I mean, that's wild. So your life is forever changed. What will you do with the rest of your life?
Well, it is my goal to be a finger pointing at the moon of truth. It is my goal to be a sign or a guidepost on the path to spiritual ascension for all humanity.
Okay, so how do you pay your bills?
Well, I'm currently working with my agent on,
you have an agent? That's interesting.
Yeah, I have an agent, and we're working on a number of projects. He's got me involved with a company or two that he owns. I have my website, which is forbiddentruthacademy.com, where I do consultations. I also have a merch store on that website where there's all sorts of merchandise people can buy, from coffee mugs to yoga mats, from yoga pants to baseball hats, from t-shirts to slides and sandals. We got it all. We got posters, we've got flags, we've got it all. And it's all awesome. So,
is there a picture of you as a QAnon shaman? I mean, even though you didn't name that.
Yeah, you got to check it out. Go to the website.
Oh, God.
It's awesome.
Well, you might as well cash in on it.
It's so good. It's so good, man.
You're not going to help yourself by disabusing yourself from that name, but by using it or, calling attention to it. But I might have to go look at some of your slides.
We have all sorts of funny stuff referencing Q on the merch store.
Yeah, that's great. Well, my best to you. And I hope that if you ever get word that there's going to be something going on, that it's going to turn into a riot or something, will you give us a heads up if you hear anything? Because people are going to start telling you stuff.
No, I would let the local police know. I don't advocate for violence. Right. I think violence is the antithesis of progress. So don't go telling me that shit. I'll tell you right now, that's not a good idea. Anybody listening, it's not a good idea.
Yeah, don't tell Jacob. Don't tell Jacob. But I still can't put this persona at the Capitol. You weren't doing anything violent. You did nothing violent. People say you had a weapon. Didn't you have some sort of stick or something?
I had a staff.
Was that a good idea?
With a flag on it.
Yeah, probably not a great idea. That's how Antifa uses. They beat people with their flags.
Oh, I'm well aware.
Oh, yes, I'm sure you are. You've been there with these as a counter protester at Antifa rallies and protests. Very interesting. Very interesting. Well, you're out of prison.
Can I plug my Twitter?
Sure.
My Twitter is at America Shaman. That's America Shaman, at America Shaman on Twitter. If you go there, you can follow me and all my progress. All the interviews I do are going to be posted there. All the spaces that I do, which I've done many thus far, are going to be there. All of my podcasts, because I do have a podcast, Forbidden Truth Podcast, is going to be there. If you want to follow me, I promise you lots of hilarious memes and all sorts of interesting information.
Donald Trump did not make you do it. True?
True. Donald Trump, nobody can make me do anything.
Well, it's just that your attorney said that he did, so.
My attorney, Al Watkins, my old attorney, Al Watkins said that I felt duped by Trump. I never said that. I never asked him to say that. I never okayed him saying that. He said all sorts of stuff on my behalf that was not true, and I never asked him to say. He said I denounced Q and the QAnon movement. Never said it, never asked him to say it. He said stuff about schizophrenic, bipolar, delusional, depressed. None of that's true. None of that was in my psychological evaluation. I have it in black and white where it actually says the exact opposite. It says I'm not being diagnosed schizophrenic and that I am not delusional.
Well, our best to you and my best to you in your new efforts in court.
Well, thank you. And as everything, pans out, if you want to do another interview, you just reach out, let me know.
Thank you. Appreciate it, Jacob Chansley. My best to you. Thanks for
Victoria.
joining the adult. Thank you. Thank you for joining the Adult in the Room podcast. Thanks for listening to this episode of the Adult in the Room podcast. To keep the programs you like to listen to, please rate this podcast with a fantastic 5 stars on your Apple Podcast app every time you listen. And give me a great review. Plus, of course, subscribe to the podcast. It makes a difference with the big tech algorithm and the big tech oligarchs, and it makes us easier to find. Please get in touch with me on all the big tech stuff. Yeah, we're still there. Using the names Victoria Taft or the Adult in the Room podcast on MeWe, Parler, Minds, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Thanks to 1ACast for imaging, editing, and production. The fantastic song is Gospel by the March 4th Band of Portland, Oregon. Music for Antifa versus Mike Strickland is Ride or Die by Raps by RC. The Adult in the Room podcast is also a production of Flamingo Road Studios. Remember, head up, heart out, and strive to be the adult in the room. Till next time, mischief managed.